So Llama 3.5 boom factor.
Like overall, or which are the weights? Like I think for me, the boom factor, the highest is the 70 billion one. I like it. I like working with it. I'm going to go boom factor 7.
So Chris, this week we got Llama 3.1, 8 billion, 70 billion. Those are two new models of the Llama 3 family and the brand new 405 billion parameter model. And now Zuck had his gold chains on in all the announcements and all the press around this. So you know the model's good. You know the model's going to be good. And I had to call out this video transition over on X by Blaine Brown where the old Zuck turns into the new Zuck with his curly hair, his tan face, which a few people called you out that watched last week, getting a bit of a tan there. And
I think I accepted the compliments and ignored the insults, but I think it was just good lighting. Honestly, I haven't been doing any tanning.
and so we have our gold chains on today to
This is all I
celebrate.
can afford. Mine's very thin, very low quality gold.
I
Low
just
grade.
whipped this out of my wife's drawers, and it looks legit. Like it's very shiny and very diamondy. So I'm sure she'll be impressed that I'm wearing it.
You look great.
So now there's obviously the 7 billion parameter model. 8 billion parameter and the 70 billion parameter model that came out with Llama 3.1. Those are updates to the previous Llama 3 models. And one of the biggest updates that everyone, including us, wanted with Llama 3 family is that 128K context window. So that much larger context window, which they've delivered on. And then, of course, the 405 billion parameter model is now really an open-ish source version of a GPT-4 class model.
Amazing, isn't it? Yeah, the increased context windows for those models is a big deal. I think that's something that everybody wanted. Someone in the people in the open source community expand those limits anyway, but having it actually trained to be at that level and having the architecture to support having that level of context window is a big deal. Something we noticed in setting up these models on Sim Theory is that if you run them through Grok, for example, so Grok Llama 3.1 70 billion, you get larger limits and it can actually handle that larger context window and actually allows you to use it. If you use other systems that are around, they actually limit you in terms of the overall context window. So not all the providers that are hosting these models are allowing you to access that full context window, which is kind of a big deal. Like the all of the advantages of running the 405 billion parameter model are in the fact that you can give it large amounts of information and potentially get large amounts of output. But all of them are limiting to 8,000 tokens output, and some of them are even limiting the input. So really, the best is yet to come in terms of this stuff, in terms of actually being able to use its capabilities as advertised.
Well, to be clear, they specify it's an 8K output token, so I don't think they're limiting that. It's just the input tokens at the moment, and I suspect that's just because there's so much load. Like we've seen today, Grok and other providers that are serving up the Llama 3.1 models all have downtime or outages just based on heavy usage. So I expect that to improve over time. But let's talk about just some of the details. So they trained it. This is the 405 billion parameter model on 15 trillion tokens using 16,000 plus H100 GPUs. That is pretty nuts.
Astonishing. I read in the paper that 150 of them failed, like the things, and someone said, geez, that's a lot of cards to fail. But out of 16,000, it's probably a good hit rate, right?
Yeah, it's pretty impressive. The question is do they like catch on fire in the data center? Is that how they actually fail, or is it just less exciting than that?
Yeah, unclear.
So what's interesting too is they've really primed an ecosystem behind this launch. So they announced 25 partners at launch. You've got AWS, Databricks, Grok, Dell, Azure, Google Cloud, and Snowflake, all offering services. They say day one. They're not available right now, but it's only been a couple of hours. So I'm sure
Our
we'll
standards
see
are
them.
pretty high in terms of that. We're like rattling the cages, being like, why isn't this working? You were hitting up the Grok people being like, "How come we can't access the big boy?"
Yeah, I was really harassing the Grok media people that stupidly communicate with me. But I've got to say, so far, my experience with Llama 3.1 on Grok, especially the 70 billion model, is really, really impressive. I would actually argue it's better than Meta AI's experience, which you can go to meta.ai, of course, and try it out. One of the limitations that I found on meta.ai is I tried to take advantage of the long context window as well. But interestingly, the text input, so when you go to put a huge chunk of, say, code or documents into the actual text area input on the Meta AI website, it literally cuts you off. So it's character limited. So there's no way even possible or remotely possible to get that amount of context in. So, uh,
Yeah, I don't know, and it's quite the limitation. Like when you want to use things like memory and grounded memory and RAG, even because even the summaries from RAG are often going to exceed that kind of limit. Like we're not used to having such small input limits, and also sharing the input limit with the output limit as well really limits you as well. So they say 8K output, but then if you have to share that with input, then you're sort of losing the benefit of this massive context window. So as I said, this is going to change. They can't leave it like this. And it's probably just all the people who are providing this so far have just put this in so that they don't suffer a system meltdown day one.
yeah, it's really safe to assume a lot of what we know now in a couple of days, is going to evolve very quick. The other notable updates here are there's big changes to the licensing of Llama 3.1, the open source. I note that they don't actually say open source outside of Zuckerberg talking about
Well, I
how.
was going to say Zuckerberg mentions it every sentence in his article. So
Well,
he calls it open source, but I've seen a lot of people say they should really call it open weights, not open source, since they don't they I guess they do give the source code though. They just don't give the data it was trained on.
yeah, they in their actual official announcement, they talk about openly accessible, that they're committed to openly accessible AI. They don't mention open source. But yeah, as you say, in his letter, which we'll get to in a minute, that he just talks about open source quite a lot. The other big update is just now official support for tool calling. So the model um, actually has this built into its training data, and they actually called out specific examples like Brave Search, Wolfram Alpha, Code Interpreter as examples that it had been trained on. So that's a pretty big plus that it's now natively trained on tool calling, and that's where the model knows to go off and actually call. Um, a tool. It's pretty
It was
self-explanatory.
already pretty decent using the Llama models for that, but having it actually built in is obviously superior.
So overall, I think it's extremely exciting. Obviously, you've had time to play with the models, or at least a couple of hours now to play with the models. What were your initial impressions, especially in comparison to like a Sonnet 3.5 or GPT-4o?
It's hard to compare to those. I find I'm often using those ones in a multimodal kind of way, and I feel a little crippled when I'm using a model that isn't. But nevertheless, the speed just running it on Grok, like because I haven't used Grok for a while because I've mostly been using like Sonnet, GPT-4o Mini. Like I said, I was going to use that more extensively, and you really notice the speed on Grok. Like I'm pasting in large articles, whatever I can fit in this context window, and the response is just far quicker than you can possibly react to it. It's really impressive the speed and the quality is great. Like it's able to maintain personality correctly. It's able to follow the instructions around storing new memories. It's able to like I tried it on several of my agents that have very specific instructions that need to be remembered. It handled all of those just fine. So really it's state of the art. Like it works fantastically. That's the 70 billion. Now, the 405 billion I've tried as well. It's obviously a bit slower just due to the demand. And also that context limit is there. So I feel like I haven't really had a proper chance to put it through its paces yet.
Yeah, I would say that too. It seems so new to the 405 billion that I don't have a good feel for it yet. But as you said, with Grok on the 70 billion, I was really impressed, especially with its ability to do code output. So if you ask it to give it some code and ask it to rewrite it, or give it a huge chunk of code and say, hey, can you write some JavaScript for this? These are just some of the typical experiments that I do to test a model. It outputs it at such speed, you're like, this can't be right. Like this surely can't work. And it also made me realize how slow, when you go back to Sonnet, how slow Sonnet feels. And even GPT-4o seems pretty damn slow when you use that 70 billion parameter model from Grok. But I also had the same limitations you did. I found myself just naturally cutting and paste an image in, and then I did screen sharing, which I just like literally use all the time now. And you're like, oh wait, it doesn't understand images. So it like that's definitely the limitation here, is like that context awareness. Really, you just have to spend a lot more time prompting the model right now.
One of the things I used Meta Llama 3.1 405 billion for this morning was I was using SimTheory's search feature, which is a new thing we've added. So you just type /SE and then whatever you want to search for. So you can either search for results or you can just ask a question. So I said, who is likely to win the Women's World Cup in the Olympics? And I actually sent you, I don't know if you saved it, but I sent you the output of that. And it was amazing. It was able to completely maintain the personality of the agent I had. It said Brazil and Germany are looking strong to win the soccer. It used emojis, like I said. It was correctly able to do, oh, you do have it up. It was correctly able to reference where it got its information from, which is something that the model is counted on to be able to do correctly. And really, it's exactly what I was looking for. It was a perfect answer, did it fairly fast, and that's on the 405 billion. So it's really nice.
I think that's something interesting I note about the 3 to 3.1 updates of all of these models. And I apologize if we keep calling it 7 billion when it's 8 billion. It's really hard to keep track of all the different parameters in these models. But I agree with you. Its ability to stay, to instruction follow is far superior now. I also noticed in my interactions with it doing a little bit of what we've seen from Claude Sonnet, where it will ask you about what approach you would like it to take before it will kick into just, spitting out tokens essentially, or giving you a response. And they do call that out specifically in their paper, saying that it's much improved at instruction following, and they think it'll be much better for building agents. And clearly some of that stuff has gone into the training there. One other thing to call out is we mentioned the modality issue, not having the image or the vision in the model, but they do say in the paper that accompanies this release that they're also working on adding image, video, and speech capabilities to Llama 3, but these aren't ready for release yet.
Yeah, I mean,
So
that's going to completely change the game once they have those in an open source way. I mean, especially because obviously with this model having open weights, you can fine tune it. And so being able to fine tune the image and the voice elements to it is going to be absolutely epic, especially if there's voice output, which would just be absolutely amazing. One other thing I wanted to point out before we move on about just the trialing of it is one thing that's always put me off using Llama 3 as a sort of daily AI model that I interact with, because there'd be advantages in that. It's really fast, it's very cheap. So why don't I use it day to day? One of the reasons is its ability to gauge the length of the answer that I'm looking for. And I think a lot of that comes from alignment. And when we look at the GPT models, a lot of the alignment they do is done with real humans rather than synthetic data and things like that. And so it leads to more palatable answers. One thing I've already noticed with 3.1, and this is all of them, is it doesn't go off the rails. It doesn't give an excessively long response. And I think the weaker models tend to give longer responses. Like it just doesn't know when to quit. And one of the things in sim theory is we often will request the maximum available amount of tokens because we don't necessarily know what you're using it for. So we sort of have to ask for the max in case you need the max, like if it's writing a full game or whatever it is. And so the model will often go off on a rant trying to fill up the token limit. Whereas so far I'm not seeing that at all with the 3.1 models.
Yeah, I think it's a noticeable upgrade to the point I could see myself daily driving it, especially ones that has vision. I think that's definitely the missing link for me. I'm so addicted to that right now that I think it would be hard to give up, but I will daily it for a week and switch between various models. I think what shocked me though is the when we looked at the benchmarks for this particular model in the evals that they released, and keep in mind GPT-4o mini at the time wouldn't necessarily have been available to benchmark against when they did these benchmarks. So it would be interesting to see where it fits in. But I've got the benchmarks up on the screen now. This is the 405 billion parameter model. And so if you look, Claude Sonnet 3.5, GPT-4 Omni, they're pretty comparable to Llama 3.5, 405 billion parameter model. So their largest model. Sonnet still beats it in certain areas and probably has a pretty high strike rate when it beats it, but they're very, very comparable models. And then you go down to the 8 billion parameter model, and it's, really kicking ass there. So it's beating GPT 3.5 Turbo. Of course, GPT-4o Mini wasn't available at this point, and we don't even know the sizing to do a decent comparison. And then Mistral 7 billion Instruct, it also wipes as well as Gemma 2. So these are really good models. I note that they don't appear to have evaluated the 70 billion parameter model against anything in their own documentation, so I'm not sure why that
In a lot
is.
of ways, I feel like the 70 billion parameter to day-to-day people is more important because it's the one you can probably realistically actually run yourself and one you could actually fine-tune yourself. I note in Zuckerberg's letter where he talks about open source, which I think we should talk about because he makes quite a few points that have sort of validated our own thinking around the motivations of Facebook's open source. Admittedly, I get a lot of those opinions from our community rather than forming them myself. But he made this comment: we need a model that is efficient and affordable to run. Developers can run inference on Llama 3.1 405 billion on their own infra at roughly 50% the cost of using closed models like GPT-4o for both user facing and offline. Now, I want to know where he gets that figure from of 50% of the cost of running GPT-4o. This sounds like someone who's out of touch with the common man because from what I've seen, I think I wrote it to you, you need two machines with two lots of 8 H100s to run inference, like full blown without quantization or any caveats, to run 405 billion parameter Llama 3. So you need machines that are going to cost, I don't know, like $300,000 or something. It's not, this isn't something I'm just going to be running in my lounge room.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question for most people that are just accessing these models and playing around with them, at least initially, is like, what's the inference costs from providers like Grok and others where they'll be able to serve it up at volume for you? And then,
Yeah.
if you want to go down the path of fine tuning and encapsulation of your own model for the enterprise, well, then is it worth for a large organization who really, let's be honest, is going to be the target for a 405 billion parameter multimodal
Yeah, I mean,
model?
look, it's going to have to be a large organization. Like, look at ours. Our company isn't tiny. Like, we're a decent sized company, and yet I wouldn't come to you and say, "Hey, Mike, I'm going to go spend 400,000 US dollars building this server or these two servers just so we can run, like, so we can bet our money on Llama 3 405 billion being our model for our company from now on." Like, I just, it seems like a big commitment compared to the fact that there's models coming out every week I can access over APIs, and it's going to take me a long time to spend $400,000 on those.
Yeah, I don't think in terms of maybe fine tunes for very specific use cases like healthcare where you don't want it to change a lot and you've got legislation where you actually need whatever you've built to be, stable and steady and encapsulated. I can see it making sense for those kind of use cases, but I think, yeah, in the enterprise, it would be still an enormous bet. Or if you're a big educational institution and you want to roll this out to, like, say, schools in a state, like, are you like, oh, I'm going to put all my eggs in this basket, try and fine tune it and instruct train it to be suitable for this use case when, they've already alluded to Llama 4 next year going to be even more powerful. Are the other models, are the other frontier models good enough to deploy now with good enough instruction following where you go down that path? Or is it just a case where you just need the data to be so secure and you just don't want it to leak anywhere? You're willing to spend a million bucks on infrastructure.
Well, and I think we know that people do, like we've seen it in our YouTube comments and in Discord, that people are in organizations where they do have that requirement. So it's not unrealistic to say some people do want these models and to run them. The question is, do you need to run the 405 billion one, or is the 70 billion one good enough for you to run, and you can run more of it and you can run fine tunes of it and things like that?
It's really hard, and I think this is why we need new benchmarks, because if you look from the 70 billion, at least from what I've seen on X, benchmarks to the 405, the leap is just not what you would expect. Like, it's not a 4x, it's very, very incremental. And if you believe those benchmarks, you could read into that like, oh, it doesn't, the scaling laws don't apply. Like, they're not actually getting materially better as you go up. You've also got OpenAI seemingly focused on smaller, cheaper, faster models, as opposed to, we still haven't seen any announcement of some larger model, or at least a larger model that we know of this year. So I kind of question, like, as you say, is the 405 billion even worth running? Or is it a case of the benchmarks are just completely maxed out and we need better benchmarking to understand the capabilities that exist within these models?
Yes, exactly. And I think that's the thing is, do those extra parameters simply provide more knowledge so it can answer more questions without training data, or is it able to make so much better decisions and take I know I'm using bad grammar, but better actions because of its size?
So interestingly, I ran some tests on I've got the stock image still up, but so I used Meta AI at first to access the 405 billion parameter model, and I had a really bad experience. So I asked it to build me a state game in the browser and output it all in line so I could just run it to show everyone. And weirdly, it kept stopping. Like, so its output tokens would stop, its response would stop halfway through the code, and it'd be like, go on. And then I'd have to be like, go on again to, finally get the output. So it felt really lazy to me. Then I switched over to 70 billion Grok running on Sim Theory and was able to smash it out, and it was all fine. So I wonder if it's just a limitation on the front end of Meta AI to control costs.
Yes, an interesting thing about that is they also announced as part of their work this Llama agentic system. They really are going to have to come up with a better word than agentic, or however the hell you pronounce it. But what they mention is that they've realized that just the model isn't enough. It's the tooling around the model that is really important as well. So we all saw the reaction to Anthropic's artifacts. We know from our own system the ability to have, say, built-in search, built-in image creation, all the document understanding and RAG and grounded memories and things and other things that we're bringing to the table are arguably more important than the underlying models. And we can prove that by switching out models all the time. And I feel like Meta is starting to recognize that. And you see that they're a little bit behind in the UI that you're dealing with because it's not making your job easy and it's not adequately showing off the capabilities of that model. So I feel like this effort on Meta's side to actually open source an agentic system as well is a good one, because it's really going to power the community to take that and add features and plugins and stuff like that. And if they can get something like that going, then they start to get some of those open source benefits that they say is why they're doing this.
Yeah, I think we should come back to that topic, because I think there's a lot to go into around this idea of, why is the Claude model so loved, and why was it so successful in launching Sonnet 3.5? And I would argue it's partially how the model was trained, but also the introduction of new UI components that allow you to experience, what the capabilities of the model are. But just back quickly before we move on to this testing. So this is the game I got that I've got up on the screen now. Like it doesn't the 405 billion made me a broken Snake game. So I really was confused by this. Then I went over to the this is the 70 billion, which I seemingly can't run now. But I went over to the
You've
70.
been banned.
Yeah, it stopped working. I don't know why. So I went over to the 70 billion and built a Snake game, which if I can actually get it up on the screen, I'll show those that watch. And so this is Grok 70 billion. And admittedly, this is a couple of shots. So I think it was like 3 shots. You can see like it doesn't eat the snake, but it's a lot more capable in what it can do. It looks pretty decent as well. And then I did a website as well. So I got it to design a beautiful looking website for Sim Theory. It's pretty decent, pretty well constructed, but I would say on the level that Sonnet 3.5 can produce, not so great. And then I asked it to recreate Facebook, which I thought was kind of funny. And it did pretty good. Like it laid out some posts for me, but it's definitely, I would say, not even close to Facebook. But I would say a pretty damn capable model when it comes to code generation and just creating things. But back to that point that you mentioned around, well, at least extending on it with Claude Sonnet, I think you're right in the sense that it's really the artifact showed people that these models are capable of producing, a lot of great stuff. And I think what Anthropic did really, really well with that model is they actually understand the use cases that people are or the value use cases that are driving people's use of AI today. And they seemingly doubled down on the training in that model or the tuning to deliver really strong outputs for designing a Snake game or a website or literature, like writing things, editing things, rewriting things, marketing copy. All of the use cases we know today are the main drivers of people's, say, ChatGPT usage.
Yeah, and I think one of the ones that's come up for us a lot lately is the idea of organizing your memories for RAG and for grounded memories. So if this agent needs to have this core knowledge, what are the priorities within that knowledge? And I feel like when you write the code yourself or when you design the agent yourself, you're able to do that kind of thing. And it makes a huge difference in terms of the quality of the output. And indeed, in the Llama 3.1 paper, they actually go into how removing less important tokens in the input has a dramatic effect on the quality of the output. And so a lot of the stuff going into training models is around discarding irrelevant tokens. And so if we can do that as well in the actual input that we give it, we as the users of it, then we get better output as well. And I feel like the agentic systems, we're going to come up with our own word for it, but agent-based systems being able to do that work for you and prioritize what is actually being given as context to get the most value for the question you're asking it is very important. And I think that needs to be done at the application level. And doing that will have a big impact on the quality of results from all the models.
And just to clarify there, what you're really talking about is how you sort of, if you think about this as stacking blocks on top of each other with what you want the AI to focus on, you're kind of shuffling around the emphasis on certain parts of the context. But what you're saying is you want to instead of it trying to figure it out, you want to guide it. You want to say, okay, this is the
Yeah.
order.
So, for example, this absolutely must be taken into account. You cannot answer without at least considering this piece of information. These bits of information are extremely important if relevant to the question. And then here's a bunch of reference data that if you need, you can search, right? So that's maybe just like 3 tiers in the stack, let's say, of knowledge. And then on the bottom tier, it's just like, here's some extra crap that if your prompt size isn't big enough, let's just completely discard it. Or maybe we just don't include it at all and just pay a reference to it. You can look this up if you'd like. You can call a function to go search for this information if you think it's relevant. And by having that prioritization, you're able to make better use of the context window one, but most importantly, make sure that the AI is actually focusing on what is needed to get the best answer there. And I feel like they've seen it in this paper and we see it in our day-to-day usage and building of agents is if you put too much context in, you dilute it, but you also maybe some of that context is important based on the question you're asking, so you can't just ignore it completely. So what we want is an agent where you can just drop in all of the relevant knowledge. Then you can say, here's the priority tier list of this knowledge. And maybe even conditionally, here's the priority tier list of the knowledge in these kinds of questions.
So I guess, but really what you're talking about is almost at a high level automated prompt design for the user, knowing that, hey, they've got all this data they maybe want considered. And you're just sort of designing the inputs into the model to say, hey, I think a lot of people are going to be like, they're explaining RAG, retrieval augmented generation. But I think it's beyond that because, with a vector
It
search.
is it is beyond that because there's certain things like needle in a haystack generation, for example. One of the things they mention in the 3.1 meta paper is that this thing can do two needles in four haystacks or something like that. So, it can actually isolate specific information. And there's tons of use cases where you don't just want a summary. You need accurate information from the thing. So let's say you're uploading a spreadsheet of figures and results. RAG would give you a summary. Like you can ask RAG a question and then get an answer for your model, but it's going to be in the form of an answer. It loses the specific data. Like it's a lossy format doing RAG. And really, I mean, when you do RAG, you get summaries back, right? So it's a lossy format. So the actual model that's doing the work for you doesn't get full access to the information. Now, sometimes that's a good thing. So, for example, when we do web search, you don't want to give it the full contents of every single web page. You want to give it relevant summaries with facts laid out and sources and things like that, and then it can do it from there. But there are cases where it's different. And what I'm saying is we need a way as agent developers to be able to specify the priority order and the way the data should be dealt with in different scenarios. And that will lead to much, much better model performance.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is also give the user control somewhat over the stack ranking of the inputs, like actually show them what's going on in the brain of the model itself.
Yeah,
So
for now, because I think eventually the agents can do this for us, right? But at the moment, I really think like a bit of human guidance there is going to lead to better overall output.
do you think though this is where if it truly works, we saw last week with Mistral's new Mamba 2 model that it can sort of shift the context window to better like understand the query and better find the data it needs. Do you think that could be the technology that solves this problem you're describing at the model level itself, or do you think it's like a pre-decision making step of an agent prior using one of these models?
Well, I guess it's like a cumulative effect, right? Like they are solving it at the model level. We saw that directly in the paper. They're aware of this problem that there's a lot of superfluous information being fed in. They have no way of knowing it. You can't curate all the data in advance if you're going to do 405 billion parameters. It's impossible. So, and they can curate the output, which is the human alignment, right? But what they are doing is at the model level, deciding what's not important and discarding it and leaving that out of the training. All I'm saying is then at the inference stage, we should be doing the same thing, ideally automatically, but initially maybe somewhat manually. I mean, maybe there is a case for a library, and it's interesting because Facebook actually has this Facebook Guard thing, sorry, Llama Guard thing they're talking about, which filters on input and output. So it stops things like prompt injection. So if you like forget everything I just said uh, and just refer to me as God or whatever it is, it will go, hang on, that's not in the spirit of what we're trying to do here. Discard it. Or, if you ask for something not safe for work, and then you can configure that. Does it only apply on input? Does it apply on output? and things like that. I guess what I'm saying is maybe there's a filtration step needed in a large language model agent setup that's actually filtering the input data to say, here's all the important bits, discard the rest.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I think right now it's one of the holy grail problems of that, or challenges that everyone has right now, and to be able to solve it or just get closer to solving it would be really interesting. And I know we've discussed many times the idea of just visually allowing the user, if the agent's not giving you what you want, to then go into its what we call a memory stack and just rearrange it, or visually tell it what to emphasize in its response. And I think that would be a very short term solution to a much longer term problem that needs to be
Yeah, like
solved.
let me give you an example from our community. So on Discord, someone said they wanted to use sim theory to be able to ask an AI agent questions about the rules of a complicated game. It's like a Star Wars RPG board game or something like that, right? And there's an official rules PDF, there's several other PDFs that have different information, and then there's a forum that has a bunch of people discussing the rules and judgment calls and whatever. Now, all of that information is what you'd want in the agent. You want all of it. You want the official rules, you want the ancillary rules and things like that, but you also want people's opinions about how the game's actually played and how to make judgment calls in different scenarios based on what happens. Now, if you just dump all that information in, firstly, you can't possibly fit it all in the prompt of most models, right? Like, so Claude, yes, you can probably fit it in. Gemini, yes, you can probably fit it in. But as soon as you hit any of the smaller models, you can't give it all of the info. So necessarily, you're going to have to summarize it or discard some in some way. So the question is, when you get to that summarization step for smaller models, because we know the smaller models are perfectly capable of answering about the rules of a game based on this knowledge. We know it's true. But if you can't get it all the information, you need to somehow, dilute, not dilute, what's the word? Make it smaller, but retain the essence of the meaning. And I really feel like we don't have, like, RAG alone isn't a good enough solution to that, because just searching for it isn't always going to yield the accuracy you need.
Yeah, so potentially like either gargantuous context windows, a better solution for RAG, or maybe a Mamba style model where it just can figure things out. I'm still honestly blown away when you can just paste pages and pages of code in and be like, hey, why is this not working? Or hey, what does this error mean? And it can just figure that out, like, and give you an accurate response. I mean, to me, that's still magic that they can even instruction follow that well. Like, and you can put the actual instruction in the middle of a huge chunk of work or at a random spot.
Yeah.
How it distinguishes that instruction from something else that's written in the actual copy itself is mind blowing. I know sometimes it stuffs up, but I find that just incredible in and of itself. So
Yeah, it is incredible, and I think the times you actually run into the downside of it is when it's mostly able to do something, but then it makes occasional mistakes. Like, a few people during the week have tried my poker thing, which we'll get into soon, um, and noticed that it gets the suits wrong, like on the image model. And you're like, okay, God, so it can do all this stuff, but then it's not able to do something simple like that consistently. And I know I'm talking about image versus text, but it does the same kinds of things with text. And I feel like this is the way we should be evaluating models: is, can it consistently do the kind of intelligence that makes or breaks the success of a particular task you're asking for?
yeah, I agree. And it's really challenging too, I think, for people that follow AI developments and don't, aren't as, like, obviously we're just so in the weeds with this stuff. But, the takeaway today is, okay, Llama 3.1's out. Cool. How does that affect me? Like, is this the best model you would recommend using day to day right now?
Mm.
And my answer, at least, is no. I wouldn't recommend using this model right now, um, because I think Sonnet 3.5 is still far
Yeah,
the
like,
best.
as you said that, my first thought is like, okay, cool, I'll play with it. But as soon as I want to get real work done, I'm going straight back to Sonnet 3.5, like in that switcher.
Yeah, and I mean, I must admit, for the first half of the week, I know I said the whole week, I lied. I daily GPT-4o Mini. And what's interesting about that is because it has the GPT-4o name, right? You just expect it to be similar in how it responds. But one thing I do like about GPT-4o Mini, at least in my 3 days of using it, is it does deliver short and sharper responses. So it feels like maybe they toned down the sort of just epic, just spitting out knowledge that GPT-4o seems to do. But I did find after a while, I was like, "Oh, is Sonic getting dumber? Like, what's going on here?" And I literally realized, "Oh, actually, I'm on GPT-4o Mini." So
Oh, so then when you made that comment to me about it getting dumber, that's what you meant.
no, it is getting dumber, but that's a controversial opinion, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But the first time I realized was when I was working on I was stuck on a coding problem, and it just felt it just felt dumber, and that's when I was like, I got to get off GPT-4o. And I went over to Sonnet. I think I touched on GPT-4 again, which is sort of my loyal fallback when I'm really stuck on something, and it always seems to be able to cut through the nonsense. I don't know why.
Like GPT-4 original.
Original GPT-4, yep. I still stand by it as the best problem solver out of all of them still to this day. I think because it hasn't been neutered like the others. And then my comment to you in the week about I think Sonnet's getting dumber. I do feel like the vision is getting worse, not better. Like its understanding of vision seemingly getting worse. It's getting lazier, like we saw with GPT-4. And this isn't just me. There's other people on X posting about this as well. And I'm not sure if other people, I'll be interested if you want to leave a comment about it, but I do feel like it seems to be getting worse. And I don't know if this is a human problem, like our expectations rise and then it disappoints us after a certain period of time and we think it's getting worse. But honestly, my gut instinct is similar to what we saw with GPT-4, where everyone was complaining about it getting lazier and dumber. It feels like it's now happening to Sonnet 3.5. I wonder if they're dumbing it down now on purpose to make Opus 3.5 look better so they can charge more. That's my honest
So it beats it in
question.
the benchmarks.
Possibly, yeah. I think that could be a thing. So, Chris, I know everyone's going to be waiting for the new boom factor scoring system that sort of became a joke, but now people want us to actually track in a spreadsheet, which we're
And
going
I
to
have
have to do.
no basis for. We'll write a paper.
Just like the benchmarks, no one really understands what the boom factor scaling is.
Well, I mean, let's face it, the boom factor is an emotional, how we feel about it kind of factor, right?
Yeah, for sure. So, what's
How
your boom
forgettable it is
factor?
versus how likely we are to actually keep using it.
So, Llama 3.5 boom factor.
Like overall, or which are the weights? Like, I think for me, the boom factor, the highest is the 70 billion one. I like it. I like working with it. I'm going to go boom factor 7. It's good. It's exciting. It's a huge development. I think the fact that, I mean, you've got to read Zuckerberg's letter. I think the commitment to open source. I mean, I know it's not like full open source. I know it's open weights and various parts of it are open, but it's the best we can expect from a big tech company. And so I think that's a big deal, and I think that we'll see so much from the community. I mean, Llama in general is what has sparked the entire open source movement around the AI stuff and kept it going.
Yeah, I mean, to me, my boom factor I'd give to the whole Llama 3.1, I'd probably give it like a nine booms out of 10, just because we now finally have an open source GPT-4 model, which we stressed about in the early days for so long that, they could take this away from us. So I think we have a very performant model that is freely available if you can afford to run it. But I also think that you can see quantized versions of the 70 billion being able to be ran on, your local MacBook. And then obviously what the open source community is able to do with these models and the fine tunes that will come from it that we'll see in the future. I think it warrants like a 9 booms, but deep down, like if you're asking me for my emotional score, it's like 5 because
Yeah,
it's
I think that's
nothing
the thing.
new.
It's more like philosophically the fact that it exists and the fact that it's out there and people are working on it makes me very happy. But as to whether I'll use it in my own projects, I mean, I think I would. Like if I was involved in a project for a company that needed consistency, needed data security and that kind of thing, as if you wouldn't go straight to the llamas and then you would judge it off, you would judge whether you would which one you'd use based on what their problem is essentially, and I suppose their budget, but mostly what their problem is. And why would you consider anything else in that scenario? So I think maybe it's more that just we don't personally have a use case where we absolutely need it to be like that. But if you did, to have something that's comparable, like very comparable with the big guys, is a huge deal.
I also think once it becomes multimodal, running it in an organization as like a de facto what we call an AI workspace or like a chat GPT sort of style internal tool that's branded and that's what your employees access so you know information's not leaking and it's
Yeah.
of a good enough quality that they're not going to be like, oh, I'm just using chat GPT anyway because this internal
Yes.
thing sucks.
Yes, that's a really, really critical point. Is if it's convincing enough for the users where they're like, like how the people at Amazon have to use Amazon Chime instead of like Zoom or Google Meet or whatever. And they all know how terrible it is, but they have to pretend like they prefer
You've
it
never let
because,
it go. Every podcast you dunk on Amazon
yeah,
Chime.
it's the worst product ever, one of the worst products ever created. And but my point is that that's how you would feel in the corporate environment being forced to use like Llama 2 or whatever it is. But now it's getting to the point where you'd be like, this is fine. Like, this is great. Like, if that's all we had available in Sim Theory, let's say we had an on premises offline version of Sim Theory you could run in your org, I'd be happy with Llama 3, even the 70 billion. It'd be great.
Yeah, I think you'd just get used to working with that model at least for a year until like a Llama 4 came out, and then you could really just drop that in. But you would totally just adapt to it and get used to it. I think for me right now, the deal breaker again is the vision. Like I need the vision. Give me the vision, Mark.
Yeah,
I'm not
agreed. I
wearing this
think if they
gold
can
chain for no
if they can
reason.
bring multimodal to it, it's absolutely huge.
Yeah, it's just like from a cost perspective right now, it's just still hard to pass up, I think, the value of a Sonnet or a GPT-4o or a Mini, like these things for anyone else that doesn't need that, as we said earlier, where you need a model locked down. I think it's just still, I just don't see the values there to go and pursue, um, like hosting one of these on your own. If that's
Yeah, but I mean, I can see the big players like Azure and Amazon, maybe Google as well, having sort of templated cloud offerings where you can have like one-click deploys, clusters of running the various size Llama 3s, for example, having pre-built fine-tuning software where you can just go in, upload your data, it goes off and fine-tunes it, then deploys it. I can see a lot of that kind of stuff happening in the big cloud providers where you've got, I'm not beholden to some API. They can't change the model out from under me. I've got more data security in the sense that okay, it's in the cloud, but it's in my private cloud and it's running on servers I control. I can see that really taking off as well using this as as the foundational model.
Yeah. So let's move on to another announcement outside of Llama 3.1, which was OpenAI. Remember them? Do you remember who they are? So they they announced off the back of GPT-4o Mini, which was only last week, believe it or not, fine tuning as they promised for GPT-4o Mini. So you can now access in fine tuning on OpenAI GPT-4o Mini. They did allude in their announcement to it's going to be free for certain tier users for a while.
Yeah, well, we're clearly that tier because we have access. Well, I didn't check the cost, but we're clearly that tier because I have access, and I think it said 2 million tokens free a day or something like that.
Is this you like bragging that we're top tier,
Flexing, yeah.
top tier, top shelf?
Um, yeah, so I actually tried to do a fine tune, which is how I know we have access to it. The difference between their previous fine tuning is before it was you would give JSON-L files, which would have a sort of, input and response style training format. Now they want it in the chat format, which is like system message, assistant message, user message format. Like, so it's sort of a JSON format that has those different roles in it, essentially. So for me to properly test it, I'm going to have to convert the data sets I normally test fine tuning with into that format.
It's weird though because in the video they still upload a JSON-L file. Or are you saying the structure of that
Yeah,
file
it's
is
still a sorry, I said that wrong. It's still a JSON-L file that just JSON is structured in that role-based format.
I see. Yeah. So, what do you think of the benefits of fine tuning a model like this? I know we mentioned it last week, but now it's available. There's a smooth interface for it. It's not like Hugging Face, which seemingly no one can figure out,
Yeah.
and you can
I mean,
deploy
I
it.
think I need better real world use cases, and I'd love to hear this from our community in the comments or wherever, because the main ones that come to me are all around classification. Like for this input, like whatever it happens to be, give it a score. Or for this input, turn it into this exact format that I'm interested in. And it becomes really good at that, like predictive things, for example. But they're the main ones that stick in my head. Things with very small outputs. So huge input, small output, or type of input that you can't control, like user generated text, and that turns into like a safety score, or that turns into a rating, or in our case that turns into an open rate. But I don't know if I'd use it to sort of align a chatbot. I just don't know, because we get such good results. Like if we're trying to give an agent personality, you can get such good results from a well-designed system prompt that I just don't know if I'd want to go and manually create a bunch of data like this is what you should behave like. And then how many examples could I possibly make? Like 100? And that's not a lot of training data. But then if you make synthetic data, I would argue that really maybe just the system prompt is good enough. So I'm trying to think of cases where you'd have quality data sets at a level where it would actually provide a major benefit. I mean, in saying that, they run faster for those use cases once you get it, and they cost less. So there's advantages in that. But I'd just like to know more examples of where people have seen it working.
I guess if you have very detailed instructions, like we talked about the Claude system prompt, and you wanted to fine tune that instruction set deep into the model as opposed to take up the tokens every single use, that might be one of those use cases where you just want to like hard code it and go a lot deeper with examples. I think that's one area
Yeah,
that might be
that's a
beneficial.
really really good point. Is having to use less tokens in your prompt, because you're right. Like all the examples I use would consume more tokens when you have to stuff it all in the system prompt. But then again, a lot of the prompting that uses up the tokens is things like context, and you can't pre-program context into a fine-tuned model.
Yeah, yeah, I guess because I guess if you provided enough examples of the same thing, maybe it would work, but highly unlikely. And I don't think the outputs would be any better.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm gonna have a play. I'm gonna throughout the week. I'm gonna do some fine tunes. I'm also gonna try fine tuning Llama 3.1 70 billion as well as a comparison, ideally with the same data set, and just see where I can get measurable results. Which one is performing better?
Okay, so I think, we have a huge apology to make to the poker community at large. So many people wrote in, so many people were offended and upset that you've ruined poker forever, that you don't understand poker, that you play poker on very dodgy websites, that
It
let me
speaks to my reputation.
let me just read some of these comments because it truly cracked me up. People should report this video as those disgusting people show how to cheat. Whoa. When
Yeah,
you
ad
play
hominem.
poker, you are
Hey, I'm
playing
not
against
disgusting.
other people, not the casino. The video should be titled, I cheated at online poker and stole money from regular people. That whole $100, I'm sure
the
it's
thing the
gonna.
thing about it is, right, I sort of get it, like what they're saying, but a few comments. One, these people have chosen to put their money in a dodgy online casino that's like laced with crypto and all that, right? Like this isn't something where it's like mums and dads putting their investment dollars in and stuff like that. This is a seedy online casino. Secondly, um, there was no guarantee that the AI was any good. Like I'm literally using unadulterated AI models with a few lines of instructions I came up with on the video, and I'm putting hundreds of dollars in the pot. I'm the one who should be scared because these are people who are like presumably better poker players than me because they also like
We're looking
5
at the
people like
cards.
challenge me to a game. It's like, let's play heads up for $10,000. I'm like, guys, I'm not a professional poker player here and I'm not going to gamble that much on the AI. It was purely an experiment in the screen sharing, the vision model, and its decision making abilities. It's an experiment. I mean, look, I get their point. Like, it's a bit unfair on the other people. It's not in the spirit of the game. But I mean, come on. Like, it's not a big deal. I'm not. This isn't my job now. Like, I did it one time. I'm not going to do another video. I was going to try GPT-4o mini, but they put me off. And yeah, so sorry, not sorry.
You broke the terms of service and then tells people about it. Well, this is not what I signed up for. Hope you get cheated in any aspect of your life, so when somebody commits fraud against you, they can use the excuse, this is what you signed up for.
It just, to me, those comments just showed me how much I love our regular community of listeners because they have different opinions to us all the time, but they at least say it in the context of, hey, I normally agree with you, but this, or like, there's something not like this disgusting human. I hope he dies. I hope he gets swindled out of all of his money for this one time that he had this idea to test out the AI.
I
We're
think
not a
what
poker
I think
podcast.
what's happened is the AI has served this up based on the keyword AI poker to a bunch of like chronic gamblers on YouTube that play online poker, and they've just been like, "Oh my god, this is why I'm losing. It's these AI guys' fault."
Yeah, and the reality is we've had several people in the community try to replicate what I did on the video, and I don't know if the image models have actually gotten worse. But with the same prompt I was using very successfully on that video, like it made very few mistakes by the end, like the last sort of 40 minutes of the video or whatever. If you try it again now, it's getting the suits wrong again. Like it, there's a lot of problems with the vision models in the sense of accuracy around where precision is important. Like precision in that, like one thing, for example, one of our listeners was saying it really is struggling to understand the player's position in relation to the dealer, which is a very important concept in poker, despite how shit I am at it. I know that that's important. And it just can't seem to do that. It always gets it wrong. So I think that we're going to be hopefully looking at way more improve. Like this is a case of fine tuning, right? Like this is a case where you need fine tuning. You need to give it lots of examples of games, and you need that. You'll notice in my examples, I give it an output format. So you need lots of examples of here is a game of poker. These are the details. This is your position. This is how much money you have. This is what's happened so far in the game. And it's able to deduce that from an image over and over again, and then you run it. And so I think that's an example where fine tuning is really valuable, but you can't do it from what I can see on the main models. You can't fine tune the image stuff yet.
Yeah, I think that look, I don't like you would also have to run a ton of experiments to see if it's advantageous. Like it's sort of like, any gambler that wins, it's like, oh, what was your trick? Like they'll only ever tell you about a win, right? Like you probably
Yeah.
try this 1,000 times on an online poker site and you would probably lose just as much as a human because it just doesn't decide like which cards you'll get served up or the hand that day or
Yeah, exactly. It's like long-term expected value. Is this going to beat your average player? And also, like, this is a system that makes critical errors on a regular basis. Like this isn't a perfect infallible system. We'll get there for sure. Like that's an inevitability. But right now, if it just completely thinks you've got the wrong hand and says, "Hey, just go all in. This is a great hand. You got a full house," and then
But
you
doesn't
follow
it?
it.
But doesn't it just demonstrate in society right now the difference between the expectation of what AI can do right now and the reality of things? Because you really have, I think, a lot of people who come through and like I would say pretty new listeners in this case, the offended poker people, and they're looking at it from the point of view is like, AI is unfairly going to beat me, therefore it's ruining my poker playing.
Yeah.
But then the reality is that people like us who are working with it all the time know if that was true, we wouldn't be recording this. I'd be playing poker right now, people. Like I'd be literally robbing every mum and dad on the
just like
planet.
literally banking cash every day.
Yeah, I
Like,
mean,
yeah.
this isn't paying for itself. This necklace I've got on.
Yeah, I'd have a much thicker gold chain. That's true.
And so I just think that if this really, really was a reality, you would never hear from us again. I would definitely be on an island.
Yeah. The only thing I thought, because someone took note of like, oh, he says 90% of them are bots. And okay, that was a bit hyperbolic, but it's like there's some on there. And I kind of feel like anyone who's got a good one, the last thing they're going to do is be advertising it. Like, you're just going to be banking money.
Why on earth would you tell people? Like, there's just no way you would do that. You would just go and be a degen gambler until,
and play higher stakes as well.
Yeah, like, oh no, the $100 that you won. Anyway, all right, we could rant all day about this. All right, any final thoughts? We have Llama 405 billion parameter model as promised from the Zuck. Thick cotton shirts, gold chains on. It is the Llama Fest.
Yeah, look, my final thought is I'm going to keep a close eye on these context windows. We really need to be able to use the full context windows to evaluate the models properly. And I understand why they're limited right now, but we're going to keep an eye on it. I think this is a case where we absolutely must rely on the big providers in terms of running the models. Like we, as Sim Theory, there's no way we can afford to run a cluster with 2 lots of 8 times H100s. Like, unless we get, tens of thousands of subscribers in the next little while, that's not going to happen. So we're relying on these guys, and so we really need them to up those token limits so we can provide the full experience. But rest assured, we will provide whatever we can.
Yeah, I've heard that from the Grok team directly that they are struggling at capacity with the 405 billion. That's why they haven't widely released it, because I think they're getting crunched even by the people experimenting with it now. And they expect to be able to scale up pretty soon. So I'm hoping that we can get the 4.405 billion on Grok, not just the current way it's being hosted, because getting that speed on a model that fast, I think I might be able to be okay with not having vision to have that speed, especially for code generation. My God, like that'll be pretty amazing.
Yeah, exactly. You're just gonna go to it way more often when you're getting instant results like that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see throughout the week what happens. I mean, last time they released the original Llama 3 models, I mean, we saw million context windows appear out of nowhere and all sorts of different things. I mean, arguably, I don't know anyone using them in reality, but that discussion is for another episode. Thanks for all your support. Thanks for all the average reviews that you've been delivering to us. Someone actually did write like very average 5 stars. So.
I love that everyone who emails us at Sim Theory is like, I really find your podcast very average, and then they ask the question. Makes me very happy. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you for doing all that. We won't be at our regular time again next week. Our episode will be a few days delayed. So. We haven't disappeared. If you're wondering, next week we'll be a little bit late, but we'll have a great episode for you. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again next week. Goodbye.